Right, welcome everyone. The keynote stopped about half an hour ago, 45 minutes ago, but there were lots of questions. There were lots of questions on the Google Doc and lots of questions in the chat that we didn't have time to get to. And you'll appreciate that we try to keep it short and sweet because keeping people online for more than 45 minutes an hour is often detrimental. People leave. But there is a distinct interest in very specific questions. So I am hesitant to just leave it because you do want some very specific answers. So again, this is the beauty of infusing UDL into presentation mode. Is the presentation was the presentation, but there's lots of ways that we can interact before, interact after, interact during, and this is one of the UDL ways to. Your UDL isn't just in your interaction with students; it's in your interaction with colleagues as well, and in a professional development that we can infuse it there too. So this is a beautiful way where we can continue to have this go on. Now, I'm not going to be able to caption this, but at CAT, hopefully, I will pass this on to them and they will be able to solve accessibility issues with regards to that. They're obviously working with tight timing. I'm doing this just as the presentation finished to make sure that you have answers to your question, and I will leave it to AdCat to actually hopefully caption this as they distribute it to you, but I will post it on my Twitter and my LinkedIn so that people can have ready access while we're waiting for the captioning to happen. Okay, so I'm going to be able to also have the luxury of being a bit more detailed, go into more complexity, more detail, speak less fast as well. Sometimes you're on the go for a quick session like this, and hopefully everyone will be able to watch this in their own time. Not necessarily today, but in future days, and to unpack this. And then you feel free to come back to me if you have more specific questions and we can look at them. So, what I've done is I've first collected all the chat questions that were sent to me. And then I've gone on to the section 4 of the Google Doc and taken the questions that you did want answered in the session, just to make sure that we've touched on them. And then I went back to section 1 of the Google Doc to look at concerns that you have to make sure that we address these as well. So I'd estimate this probably lasts over an hour, but you will be able to then watch it in your own time and in sections probably. So first question was, I'm wondering how UDL works alongside person-centered approaches for support with students with disabilities. So I think I did touch on this one at the end, and also when I was talking about the overlap between UDL and existing pedagogical philosophies. Now, person-centered approach is not necessarily a pedagogical approach. It's more of a counseling approach and a general holistic approach to students' needs generally. But I think it's the same principle, right? It's all of these existing philosophies. You don't have to abandon them. You can draw them into UDL. What UDL does is it forces you to think beyond the individual need, to look at how can you infuse them in your classroom design. How can you provide this to everyone rather than just one person? So there will be probably some really great example of person-centered, holistic teaching and practices that instead of just providing in a retrofitting way to one single person, you're able to infuse into your classroom practices and deliver them systematically as part of your delivery or as part of your assessment. And again, the lesson there is, don't abandon these past teaching philosophies that you've worked richly with. Take them into UDL. Again, UDL is going to be a framework that allows you to do that. It allows this osmosis for you to bring these teaching philosophies or other approaches into UDL, but to keep the focus on accessibility, because the focus remains inclusive design. Yes, you can do active learning, but it has to be active learning that is inclusive for all. So it's going to be, again, that happy place. Not every active learning is going to be inclusive and fully accessible, but you're going to be able to find a fair bit of it that is inclusive for all students in the classroom, and you're going to be able to focus on these practices. How would you go about, so this is question 2, how would you go about implementing UDL when there's gatekeeping, access to deans, to have a direct conversation? So here, really what you're hinting to is what I've talked about, the highly political landscape of tertiary education. It is very political. And again, depending on who's the advocate and the ally bringing the UDL discourse to the table, you may sometimes get pushback that has nothing to do with UDL, but it has to do with the existing political and allegiances that that unit or that stakeholder has within a campus. And we see that a lot. We see a lot of people push back against UDL because it is carried by accessibility, or because it's carried by someone specific in teaching and learning, or because it's carried by a CEDA, an equity and diversity office or human rights office. So we've got to be sensitive that it's not just the content and the messages, but sometimes people are shooting the messenger just because they're the messenger, not because of the message. And that's going to be important in your ecological analysis, that you're able to say, well, if that's not carried well by this unit, maybe in our strategic planning and our ecological mapping, we should give this to someone else, or maybe a different sort of coming together of different stakeholders, but not the one that's getting the pushback, right? So think of that. But in general, the question of deans as well, so I when I joined McGill, I had to do, as I said, diversify your message. I'm not joking, I had the 2-minute elevator speech, I had the 5-minute elevator speech, I had the 15-minute elevator speech, I had the 25-minute elevator speech, I had the hour, the 2 hours, the 3 hours, and I would never say no. So if ever someone invited me to a dean's table, to a faculty council, to a special PD day, I would say yes, and then I'd take what they gave me, and then I would try and give them the essence in that, and then people will call you back, and people will contact you back, and they'll want more. So I think it is a political strategy to become that spokesperson that just makes the message makes it palatable, easy to digest for whoever you're talking to. And then trust me, they will come back and they will want more. And don't forget that also when I was talking about carrying those 5 pillars of the needs, one of those 2 of these needs, in terms of sustainability and resource management, you're talking dollar sign, and it's a big, big card when you walk into senior administration now and you say, this is very costly. Retrofitting is very costly. And if we spend that money on supporting faculty as they develop a UDL approach, you're cutting down the demand for services and accessibility services. There will always be demand, but you're cutting it down in a major way to the point where it'll become, like it was in the 60s, a very negligible amount of spending. And that money that is spent towards supporting faculty is sustainable because it will not go on year after year after year. Once you make that push for training and professional development, that spending is done, but it's actually changed teaching practices and it's having an impact. A dollar spent for a student is one thing, but a dollar spent on an instructor that then changes teaching practice with 30 students, it's a 1 to 30 ratio. You're spending your money more wisely. So we can't stop doing the support with individual students, but we should have a lot more focus on the sustainable spending that we do in terms of changing instructional mindset and infusing inclusive design and UDL there. Is it necessary for SES that UDL be at the goal at the institutional level? I hope we've touched on that. It was in my ecological mapping, top down, bottom up, what we discussed. No. In some cases, I've seen small institutions where the bottom up has worked really well, working through community of practice, modeling, and then has grown from that, has been scaled up. It doesn't work everywhere, and it probably wouldn't work in a larger institution or an institution that's very historical and has very set hierarchies. That's why your emotional, your social, your ecological mapping is essential. You will see whether being embedded in your mission statement and having buy-in at the very top is important or not. Now, eventually, whichever way you go, 10 years down the line, you're hoping that you've scaled up sufficiently that it does eventually, regardless, become embedded in mission statement and at the highest level. But it doesn't necessarily have to be at the beginning. Where I worked at McGill, 40,000 students, over 6,000 faculty, it needed to be at the top. And we had a beautiful alignment of, a president, a VP academic, and a head of student services that were all aligned with this, and that made it possible. But other institutions may be the contrary. Another question there, but I've said I would share my slides on Twitter and LinkedIn, and it says, what if you don't have Twitter and LinkedIn? But just contact me. My email address can be found easily if you Google Frederick Fauvet. I think I'm the only one who has that name in the world, so you're going to hit me very quickly. You'll find my email, and then I'm happy to send you what I've posted on LinkedIn or Twitter. Ecological mapping, also known as organizational network analysis. Well, yes and no. I use ecological mapping in the wider sense. So if you go to Bronfenbrenner, who looked at ecology in community care and in childhood development, etc., but then started talking about if you look at ecological framework being used in, for example, analyzing difficult behavior, challenging behavior in schools. Here, we're no longer putting the child at the center of the diagram, but we're putting the teacher at the center of the diagram because they also have systems that interact and create some of the dynamics that we see every day. And then we can start talking about clash, lack of fit between 2-person systems. Well, here you're talking about putting the unit that is driving the UDL change in that diagram, and then mapping out what are the systems around it and how do these systems interact with that unit and with its agenda and interact with each other. Once you do that ecological mapping, you will be able to see whether the person that you've given the agenda to is suitable or not, or whether it needs to be a combination of stakeholders, and who that stakeholders, who the best stakeholders might be. And that's going to depend on institution to institution. Is there a difference between implementing UDL in higher education versus foundation education? No, and I wish we had time to touch on that more, because you very wisely want to talk about tertiary education generally. So depending on where you are, in Ireland, in the work that they're doing with UL, they're differentiating between higher education and further education. We talk about universities and community colleges. You talk about foundation education and higher ed. All of these environments in various jurisdictions have had some success with UDL. So again, I don't think there's something inherently compatible between UDL and further education or community college or higher education. Again, the ecological mapping might mean that in different countries and different jurisdictions, some of these sectors have more ease with it than others. I would say that in Ireland, for example, the further education sector has done really, really well with UDL, done great giant steps. In Canada, we're also seeing community colleges which can have two purposes. They can serve as the end of the secondary, or they can serve as transition to higher ed. So three purposes, or they can be a diploma or degree in their own that they deliver usually in trades and applied subjects. We've got a huge success among community colleges in Canada. I would say that that's a sector that's moving the fastest, because they have an immediate understanding of the diversity of learners, which has changed radically. They are very conscious of the needs of the employment sector, and they're working with a faculty that is often not full-time and is therefore sometimes more open to change than sometimes people who are career faculty. I think for all of these reasons, community colleges have had a lot more success. So definitely not just for universities. You will find it in all of the sectors of the tertiary. And then we can give you some more examples depending on the jurisdiction, etc. The next question is about the checklist, because I said once you've done the checklist, you're in a dead end. No, I actually would I'm going to stick to my word there, because I've been in this for over 15 years, and whenever you see people starting to look at checklists, they are usually really going on the misconception of what UDL is, because really it can't be a checklist, because especially for us in tertiary, because depending on what discipline you're in, depending on whether you're looking at foundation education, undergrads, postgrads, etc., whether you're looking at traditional lecture style or lab or in the field education, all of these variables will mean that the lens that you apply will be inclusive design, but the result of what you get is going to look extremely different. And that's the beauty of it. And that's why it cannot be a checklist, because you will never find something which is inherently UDL. It will be UDL if someone had a starting point where things were not inclusive, not accessible. They applied UDL as a lens, and they got to a design solution which works for them in the context, depending on these variables. The process is UDL. It's not the result that is UDL. The result is only UDL for that person in that context, having gone through this complex reflection around inclusive design and removing barriers. You can't take the results and say these are things that will be accessible UDL in any context. It doesn't work. So that's why I think it's very important you stay away from checklists. Checklists never work. And I'll give you an example. The flipped classroom, is it UDL? Well, it can be UDL. If I'm teaching, and I use it every so often, it enables some of my students that are not happy in a traditional role, sitting in a lecture, to be active and talking to others and moving around. But if you use it every day, as I've seen, for example, Simon Fraser chemistry departments only teaches through the flipped classroom. So students arrive every day and they sit there and they listen to, they see a question on the board and they talk to each other for 3 hours. And apparently faculty don't even give them the answer when they leave. And that's the format every single time. Well, if you do that every single time, you are creating barriers for a whole variety of students. So you're eroding them for a bunch of students, but you're creating them for another. So you see that's a perfect example that a result, a solution, can in itself be UDL in a context, and then you put it in another context and might not be UDL. It's really important that we really always reframe that in an instructor's reflection on practice in their context. And that's what's going to give you UDL results. Okay, on to the next question. As disability practitioners are often administrative staff, what tools can we use to get academic staff on board with UDL? This is really complex, and I did a study recently on UDL and mental health, and I interviewed faculty, accessibility staff, and instructional designers in universities that have instructional designers. And I looked at their understanding of how design impacts mental health. And the very sad thing is that I would say that all three groups have some understanding of how the design of an learning experience has an impact on the mental health of students. So either creating mental health issues or exacerbating them. But the resounding result of that study was that none of these groups talk to each other. And this has got to do with hierarchical status issues, with the fact that if you're an instructor, you only talk to designer when you want and you ask them specific things of an instructional designer. If you're an accessibility folk, you talk to students, but you really have hierarchical barriers and ever ringing an instructor and saying, by the way, I've noticed that in this course, we get hundreds of students coming back because they have very specific issues with certain designs in that assessment. They don't have that freedom, and they can't have the freedom. It would be hierarchically really problematic. But even accessibility folks and disability and instructional designers don't talk to each other either. So we do have a problem there with the fact, again, it takes you back to that ecological sort of mapping, that whoever you put in the driver's seat for UDL has to have some comfort level with doing picking up the phone and having this communication line with all of the stakeholders. And that's not always easy because some of our tertiary stakeholders don't have that. They're locked into fairly status conscious hierarchical position where they can only really talk to certain people and not initiate certain conversations about design. So it is problematic. It needs a lot of reflection. There's definitely an issue with pedagogical staff not wanting non-pedagogical staff to talk to them. When I was at McGill, the way we try and create that was we created a set of videos, and we created 2-minute videos. And what we did is we used the students to say, okay, so we did the UDL 101 course for students. And so once they understand what UDL was, we said, do you have anyone that you think models this, that is already doing this? And then they would point to very specific people, and we would contact this faculty and say, right, we work with accessibility, but we'd really like to create a showcase of sort of do-it-yourself videos on UDL, and our students are talking to us about this. So we had very specific things to bring, not just a video about UDL, but the way you're designing your rubrics in your assignment, the way you are creating multiple pathways while you lecture, etc. And we would say, could you do a 2-minute video? And then we had a student who's really good with audiovisual, and that really had some of the technical side on down to an art. And they would do 2-minute edited videos showcasing for faculty what they were doing and how it fit within UDL. And I think if you are from accessibility services, that's going to be the best, is to find these ambassadors that you draw in, and then they do the material for you to present to others. The ambassador, we didn't have time to talk about it, but it was one of the questions. I think it comes up later. The ambassador issue is really good. I know I worked with Trinity College Dublin recently, and they have launched a big inclusion drive that embeds a lot of and integrates a lot of UDL work. And they work really with this notion of ambassadors, training a certain number of people who can then be the spokespersons within those departments. So even as accessibility, if you're able to reach out and have very specific faculty contact that can be your ambassador within each department, each faculty, that breaks that hierarchical status issue. And I think that's really, really important. Okay. Could you please explore some more examples of UDL? So this is a bit on the borderlines of this talk, because we had specifically said that really we would look not at the pedagogical, know-how and how to do UDL in the classroom, but we would look at the next stage. So how do we get through the strategic challenges? But there are lots and lots of really good videos out there. I mean, when you approach UDL, it's always really that dichotomy first of breaking down your thinking on design, not tackling everything at the same time and saying, right, so I'm starting that reflection, I'm an instructor, I'm really starting to convert and progressively transform my pedagogy. So I will take my time and I will do it one thing at a time. And so you randomly decide, am I focusing on instruction, on delivery, or am I focusing on assessment? That's usually the way people start. And then once you made that choice, you look at your practices and you start looking, okay, I'm doing this. Is there anything that creates barriers in my work? So, if you're going for assessment, usually the very basic work that people will start saying, right, okay, what about the way I present my directives for assessment? Do I create multiple pathways there? Often no, it's very dry, it's very paper. So first of all, extending those directives and then understanding that students will have a different a facility with it, whether it's spoken or whether it's written or whether it's a video. So a simple thing like this, creating your directives in 3 modes. I do that systematically, and you will realize that people who would not necessarily understand the directives in writing will understand it in video, because you will use it slightly different tone, vocabulary, you will explain things differently, and that might be sufficient for them to get it. But you don't take away the written rubric, in the written directives. You keep the directive and then you diversify the way you present it. And that will create multiple pathways for your students. Then going into the rubrics themselves, your rubric may be very automatically saying, I want a paper, or I want an essay. And that's when it comes down to that notion of core objective that you're teaching and assessing. Are you actually assessing writing? If you're not assessing writing, then does it have to be an essay? No. So suddenly it frees you. What else could you allow? Well, you could allow them to produce a video. You could allow them to produce a podcast. You could allow them to set up a role play where two students are assessed at the same time and they demonstrate their skills through a conversation. That sometimes lead to people saying, well, could we act out? I work in education graduate level, but I've had some excellent submissions sometimes when I wasn't assessing writing, when people acted the assignment and were able to demonstrate the skills in the little scene. Media montage, cartoons, animation. Progressively, as you go into your exploration of EDL, you'll get more relaxed and start saying, okay, well, I see the competence I'm assessing, but now I can give a lot of freedom in the way they're being assessed, because none of those actually have to do with written work. I still have, obviously, some assessments that are full-time papers that are assessing written work, but often you have multiple assignments and some of them are not assessing that, so you can give a lot of freedom. So that would be a beginning of an exploration regarding format and rubrics. With regards to delivery, often it's very sort of, if it's lecture style, well, what else can you do? So thinking, I'm going to change roles frequently, so I can still have the lecture, but I may have sessions that flip the classroom. I may have, activities during the same 3 hours when students are actually doing something else in another way. So you are creating multiple pathways to the same classroom goals within that session. But again, this was really borderline of the objectives for this session. Not that it's not a relevant question, but it would take a whole probably half day to really do it justice and actually give you lots of examples. So this session today was supposed to be more strategic and organizational in terms of going to the next step rather than going back to the basics of how do we do UDL. But lots of resources are there, and if you want some, please contact me and I'll give you some specifics depending on what you're looking at. How can UDL apply to ESL students with broad range of English while retaining structure and clarity? Yes, so I think we didn't have really time to go beyond impairment, but one of the great, really sort of of awareness moment in 21st century for North America has been to suddenly realize that actually everything that we say about students with disabilities, this notion of creating barriers, right? This social model view on teaching, it's not about exceptionality. It's about the way we design. It's about the barriers that are created by the environment that the students encounter. That's where the disability lies. Well, that's once you've shifted to that notion of looking at analysis of the barriers, not a focus on the exceptionality, you quickly realize that the barriers that you're coming up with and identifying for students with disabilities are actually the same barriers for our indigenous students, for as international students and first, second language learners, for our first generation students, for our racialized students, for culturally diverse students, to an extent for LGBTQ2S plus students. So you suddenly realize that these barriers are actually in common for all of these learners. So in fact, there's more and more work being done now, realizing, first of all, the political momentum, because if you're trying to push this on a campus and you are working with 5% of the population, or 5 to 10% of the population is registered with an accessibility office, that gives you some momentum. But when you realize that you add to that 5% of indigenous students, 25% of international students, second language learners, 10% of first generation students. You're above 50%. So more than 50% of our student population is experiencing the same barriers with the design of the learning experience. So this has led to really a widening, first of all, a political understanding that by coming together and joining voices, the people who support all of these diverse learners can actually create real momentum on campuses for UDL integration, because it's not just for students with disabilities, it's for all of our international students, all our culturally diverse students, all of our indigenous students, etc. But also that when it comes to the tools that we develop within a UDL reflection, they actually serve a real wide variety of students within the classroom. So a lot of work done around ESL learners. So if you're interested in this, I did in my role at UPI, so I didn't have time to explain this. But when I worked at UPI, I was head of a master's called Global Perspective, which actually had 100% international intake. And I arrived there from an accessibility background with my UDL tools, having to teach a classroom where often the students were really, first of all, battling with mastery of English as they were being thrown into the deep end of graduate course in education. And for me, it was a natural switch. It was a natural shift to understand, well, everything I'm doing with students with disabilities works really, really well with this newcomers to Canada. Had great success. I was, academic lead in that program, was able to really show other contract faculty that, look, this is the way to do this. If you're not comfortable with ESL battling all of these challenges, you should really look at UDL. And this has led to the writing of a chapter in a book published by Bracken and Novak in 2019. I can't remember the title, but you will find it easily. And that's a chapter where I talk about this experience leading this program for 3 years and using UDL within an international student second language learner context. So lots to read there if you are interested. And I can give you some further details in writing. Please suggest research that documents UDL is practical for staff and benefits for students. So you do have a lot of references in the slides. I can give some more references if you have more targeted requests. It's a bit wide. I mean, the UDL body of literature is really growing fast. I did publish as well, edited a book with IGI Global called Case Studies in Application Implementation of UDL across disciplines, so specifically about higher ed, 33 chapters from across the world of examples of UDL being applied in various contexts. So it's something that I could recommend too, but there's a lot more. There's a work of Cheryl Buchstaller in Washington State Uni, I think, the Do It and she has another book, which is an open access book on UDL in higher education as well, which you will find online. Buchstaller, there's an HLER. So a lot of resources now. So you'd have to be, I think, at this stage more targeted, more focused. But do contact me; I can give you some more targeted sort of resources. Will I address funding issues in order to implement UDL and support from government bodies? Yeah, the funding issue is very important and complex. We are, as I said, sitting between two chairs. So we are still funded per head, per disability, per impairment, focused on retrofitting individual interventions with students. But we have to move to something else. And there's a lot of juggling there. And having been a head of an accessibility office, you do the juggling. And I finished my term there after 5 years being able to do both, use some of the funding for intervention, indirect intervention in retrofitting to students, but also dedicating a lot of that funding to supporting faculty and developing a UDL mindset on campus. We have to be creative, and that's the key. That's the role of people in management, that they understand that we are stuck in an old model, which everyone says is dead. I mean, I've been sitting at a very high level table in Canada where every provincial government says, well, we can't carry on funding retrofitting in this way. So it's dead. That funding model is dead. It's just a matter of when governments will actually take the leap and actually say this is officially obsolete and we're going to something else. And then this new funding model where really you're trying to apply whatever money you have to creating the greatest sustainable development and change in mindsets among faculty. So again, sitting in two chairs, you have to be a bit creative, you have to play around with your funding and etc. But there's a lot of leeway for having done it. If you were in the right mind for acrobatics, there's a lot of stuff that you can already do. And unfortunately, we're going to be sitting between two chairs for a while, and we have to be creative with that funding and be able to do both. UDL versus differentiation. So I did tackle that, particularly for the tertiary sector. Yes, differentiation is, I think, really almost absurd in the tertiary sector. It's very beautiful for the secondary sector. Again, even in the secondary, you need to have fairly experienced and competent teachers. Novice teachers are completely daunted by it. They find it's just too much to ask them to go in there and do that juggling. Carol Tomlinson can do it. I've taught for 20 years. I can do it. But, once you've taught for a long time, yes, you're able to do it. For young teachers, it's asking a lot. And for tertiary educators, it's absurd because, again, they may not see the students for very long. They may have a lot of students in the classroom. They don't have time to understand the needs or even have the windows to understand the needs. Don't forget, a lot of students by then are very reluctant to disclose and to be stigmatized as having, needs or being diverse. And then a lot of our faculty, particularly in tertiary community colleges, often are very, very much content experts and have very little training in pedagogy. So asking them to juggle that content to find multiple pathways on the go just in time as they're teaching is impossible. Now, asking people to UDL and to do it slowly, progressively, in that downtime, every time they have an opportunity to redesign a course, redesign an assessment, rethink a resource, that's a lot more relaxed. And I think it's easier to get people to get buy-in. And I've often seen people, in sessions get, whew, okay, shoulders go down. You're not asking me to do that. You ask me to do that. That I can do. That I can tackle with support as I go through. So really, really important. I think really that's part of the big dead end that we've had in tertiary inclusion, is that is the only model that we were offering people. Either retrofitting, which is terrible because it's not my problem, someone else will do it, so that's obsolete. But when they even try and re-empower themselves and do it, if differentiation is the only thing you're presenting, it's doomed to fail. It's not going to work. It is not fit. It is a lack of fit there with the tertiary model. How do we encourage cultural change? Well, again, I think you've got to be hopeful. I think I achieved a lot in McGill in 4 years on a very large campus, and people said, "Well, how did you know you were going to succeed?" Well, I didn't know I was going to succeed. I just jumped. At one point, you have to take a jump on the cliff and say, "If you don't start somewhere, you're not going to get anywhere." So, one thing I would say is that you have opportunities that arise. And about a year after doing this McGill, we had a day where we have something called a joint Senate board meeting. So the executive and the Senate meet together, and they want a day of PD, and this happens once every 6 months, I think. And they contacted us very quickly and said, could you design a UDL experience for the board and the Senate to be exposed to that? And that was a huge. So I think you need to approach with confidence, and if you have confidence in change, opportunities do arise, and then you jump on them, and then you take them on board. And that was a huge success. And shortly after that, I remember I had the Montreal Gazette, the local big paper, the biggest paper in Montreal and in Quebec, English speaking, contacted me and said, we'd like to do a piece on this. And I had to obviously go through our press office and get this cleared. But people said, yeah, do it. And actually, I realized quickly that someone had sort of tipped the journalist anyway that this was good. And, and there was a whole page, a whole, old newspaper style then in those days still, on, saying McGill's taking the lead in, changing, inclusive practices and implementing this UDL thing. And that's amazing how once you are hopeful and you put the engine on and you go full speed, you will get these opportunities, and you will get things like visibility and credibility and work with these opportunities. Because the day I had that, people turn around and say, wow, okay, there's pride here. We're doing something great. And suddenly people who are not necessarily, receptive suddenly become really interested. It's a complex political environment. I can't be more candid than that. Use it. You have to sometimes use it and use your best strategies and competencies to make the most of the opportunities that present themselves. But I think that's how you do a cultural change. You go at every opportunity that you have, and you really differentiate your approaches to get the maximum exposure. Guidance on how to effectively start implementing UDL so that it's not necessarily overwhelming for teachers. So again, I think we tackled that well. It's that sort of, first of all, place yourself on the spectrum. Where are you? What do you do that's already UDL? That's already going to get people very relaxed. Then also stress the fact that you are not asking them to renegotiate their core skills and competencies, the ones that they're teaching and assessing. Those, if there's transparency and the students know as they go in that you are learning this and you're being assessed on this, that doesn't have to be touched. It's everything else that can gain in flexibility because it's not essential to the core objectives and core assessment. So people relax as well. You see people's shoulders drop. Okay, you're not asking me to, to change my standards or change my objectives. No, no. Well, I'm asking you. You have integrity of that, but everything else around, you have a lot of change that you can do and redesign differently. And then the last thing is tell people, actually beat it into them. It's not an overnight change. Don't do that tonight. Don't burn yourself out in 2 weeks redesigning everything. Take some time. Do one thing, do it well, implement it, get your student feedback. They're going to love it. They're going to come back to you. Okay, well, as you do this progressively, people feel more relaxed. Okay, I've tried it. It really works. Now I'm tempted. That's the motivation. It becomes a carrot. You create the carrot by doing the process the whole way. You get the student satisfaction. It motivates you next semester into trying something else. And progressively, your toolbox, UDL, because you don't just try these things, they stay there systematically in your course outline, in your assessment, in your rubrics, but you enrich it. It becomes more and more and more UDL as you go forward. I'm looking for research-based evidence that UDL has benefits for students. Well, okay, this is problematic. So there is a lot of research now out there, but I think whenever we're looking to say my university or my campus cannot do this because there's no evidence-based, don't forget that, first of all, it is very difficult to get that sort of methodologically, because really you're talking about a human rights environment where to do comparative studies, you would have to do something really strange, like say, half my class is being exposed to DL, the other half not, or this class is being exposed to UDL, but the next section, which is also doing it, is not. And then you're doing a comparative study, and that would have a net benefit of showing you the benefits of the UDL approach. But we can't do that because we work in an equal opportunity environment where if you deny certain opportunities to half your classroom, you will land yourself in some serious human rights infringement. So really, short of saying, okay, well, 1 year I do it this way, and another year I do it this way, but that's also dodgy methodology because there's a lot of other factors that can affect, learning impact, your own disposition, things happening around the classroom. That means that they may lead to effects. So you wouldn't really be able to either compare a cohort, from 1 year to the other if you alternated, being UDL, not being UDL. All this to say that really it's not very healthy or very sane to be trying to do these kind of control studies. Therefore, evidence, in quantitative studies that are showing a net benefits are going to be rare, but there's a reason why we don't have many of these studies. Now, also taking into account that it's problematic, right? We know, for example, that inclusion is a good thing for many theoretical, philosophical reasons. Social capital, equal opportunities, human rights, etc. Preparing yourself for the diversity in the real world. We haven't waited till we had evidence that inclusion works to implement inclusion in environments like the K-12 environment, because we know that the imperative is it needs to happen. Therefore, the logic is being implemented, and then we'll collect evidence, and that will show that indeed it is good. So the danger here is also saying if we wait to implement UDL till we have results on UDL, well, it's the chicken or the egg thing. It's never going to happen. At one point, you have to say this is a good model. This is creates inclusion, good results theoretically and philosophically. Let's do it, and then eventually, as the body of literature builds. So, I think it is kind of a false dead end there sometimes when people say, we can't do this till we have the evidence. Well, if you don't do it, you'll never have the evidence. So you have to flip that sometimes around. Strategies for approaching leaders in helping them understand the benefits of UDL. So again, that I think is covered. Go back to that first section of the presentation, those 5 needs. If you show to people that the system is crumbling, people don't want to carry on working with a system that is crumbling, and the system is crumbling. Look at the waiting time, look at the frustration at accessibility level because of the explosion of demands. Look at the frustration of faculty who receive letters they don't understand and asked to do things they have no really competencies to be doing, right? That letter of accommodation that often we get in North America. I'm supposed to do what? You don't even identify what this is. Someone in my class has a need. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to implement. So the frustration felt there. All of these things show you that the system is failing. No administrator is going to want to carry on that once you evidence the fact that the system is failing, and then that's where UDL becomes appealing. So that's your buy-in. That's why you really show them that things are crumbling. It needs to happen. Using UDL for work integrated learning internships. Yeah, so I didn't have time to get onto that, but there's actually a lot of work being done. In the book that I published with IGI Global, there's a couple of chapters on internships and placements. There's a piece I've co-wrote with two education practitioners, two faculties in education, two members of the Faculty of Education at McGill in 2011, I think, where we looked as well at stages and internship. The problem there, to be honest, is that often people say, "Oh, we're ready," but the outside world isn't. No, that's not true. If you look, and I've worked a lot with field placements, they are more than ready to go ahead. They have often the fingers on the pulse of human rights law and employment law. They know they have to do this. It's more us in universities that are playing gatekeepers. Now, this, the setup with field placement is really complex because it must be the same in Australia. We often have to beg and plead to have these placements. We have very delicate relationship with the field coordinator. We don't want to compromise. And that's the language that you hear people say, I don't want to compromise this. I don't want to load them and burden them with issues of accessibility and inclusion or with UDL. So I'm going to play it cool, and I'm actually going to say often, even deter students from going to field placement saying, well, it's not going to work for you. Often when you talk to the field coordinators, they are more than happy to do this. But we are so busy playing gatekeepers that we don't realize that they're receptive and they're happy to do it. I'll give you an example. I work at McGill with a PTOT office, so physical and occupational therapy office. They have very, very heavy field placement in year 4. And they have a lot of students who do very well academically and then fail the field placements. One of the field placements that I was called in to negotiate, student academically very strong, was failing placements. And the reason why they were failing placements is because they'd used, software, writing software, on their laptop forever, and then suddenly they were taking notes on clients in 5 minutes between appointments, and they had to do it with pen, and they hadn't done pen for 15 years, and they didn't have any other strategies that they needed. And all we had to say is talk to the field coordinator and say, well, they've been using software. Could they use software? And they said, of course they could. It's about time, for example, probably we should buy everyone tablets, and we should have tablets for patient notes. So they introduced tablets. In fact, they introduced tablets for everyone. So their first reflex was UDL. And then that students did very well. So there's a will and there's a desire. And in fact, the field is moving faster than we are moving in the tertiary. So often it's a matter of looking at ourselves and saying, okay, can we do things differently? Can we stop being gatekeepers? And can we be proactive in how we look at others? The framework, organizational change, top down versus bottom up. Not going to go onto that because we have talked about it at length in the session. I think that's been answered. What existing resources are available for building UDL capacities with regard to academic staff? So I think this again is fragmented. This depends on where you're looking at: undergraduate, postgraduate, vocational. I think it's very different. People have very different needs, and now there's starting to be resources that are very targeted at very specific environment, context, experience, etc., and clientele. So those resources are there. Contact me if you have something specific in mind. How can partnership be developed to address concern about dollar and cent costs? Include a resource to share implementation includes. UDL isn't expensive. People say, oh, cost. It's, in education generally, I hear it in the K-12 and I hear it in post-secondary. We want change. We like change. Oh, we can't do change. We don't have any money. Again, we are in a neoliberal environment where there is no money, and we've all been told we will never have money, and you have to do more with less. So you embrace that, and you realize that UDL is actually not about money. It's usually it actually requires very few resources. It requires time and the desire and the willingness to really go deep and actually make that professional development happen. But it's not buying tech and doing. Often you have all you need. It's a change in mindset. Change in mindsets are not expensive. They're difficult. They're challenging. May take time, and they may have secondary costs in the sense that you own something for a long time. So yeah, you're spending money triggering the change. But once the change happens, it's not. I don't think there's ever a dollar sign that you're waiting for. I think on the contrary, the dollar sign is with retrofitting. We spend an enormous amount of money. If we spent even half of that into changing mindsets, you would have the work done in a couple of years. So I think there it's a matter of reframing the money question. What framework might work for organizational change, top down, bottom up? Okay, we've dealt with that. How UDL works alongside person-centered approaches, we've looked at already. I answered that at the top. The practicality of implementing UDL in schools, especially in time constraints. Yes, so I think that's where you're saying, yeah, I know it's tough. You're not going to do this overnight. You are overstretched, you are oversolicited, you're getting bombarded from all sides. That's why UDL is good, because you can say focus on one thing this semester and on another thing next semester. We're not asking the world of you. We're asking with progressive, slow, career-long changes, and that will get you there. So I think that's the way you release the pressure. So these are no longer questions. This is where the top section of the Google Doc where you had concerns. UDL and implementation in countries with the majority of under-resourced schools, especially those that do not necessarily have access to technology. Yeah, you don't actually need technology to do UDL, but obviously technology has helped UDL. So, I always say I took a course at University of Montreal, and I had an instructor who was about 70 years old and taught a class of 35 in an old-fashioned lecture hall with the seats are going up to the top. And she did UDL, and she did it by running an awful lot in 3 hours, but providing multiple pathways to everyone in the classroom, doing it in a systematic, sort of pre-designed way that had worked for her for a very long time. But she didn't have technology. It just means she was running a lot. I think technology it's not the condition, the precondition, or the quasi condition, or quasi non-condition. You can do it with no technology, but technology has just made our job a lot easier. Often there are shortcuts to what we're trying to do, but the intention isn't linked to technology. You design the solutions, and then technology helps you do it more efficiently or quickly. I had another prof as well. I took a sort of organizational change class at University of Montreal as well, in a diploma where you walked in and there was an old-fashioned piece of paper stuck with a duct tape at the door, and he said, "Oh, by the way, choose your assessment format. So, for the first sheet, you're having a final exam. For sheet 2, you're doing a presentation and a final exam. For sheet 3, you're doing a presentation and a project. And for sheet 4, you're doing a project and a presentation." Anyway, he had also that, all UDL, no technology, old-fashioned pieces of paper stuck on with duct tape at the entrance. And I talked to him, and I was like, "You realize this is like so UDL?" And he had never heard of it. And that's what's the beauty of it. You're going to be able to bring people in who may not have that discourse, but they're already doing it. And then when they have framework, their eyes light up. They go, "Oh, finally, I have a framework. What I'm doing, it makes sense." But technology usually is not the big condition that we think it is. A lot of these people are doing this without it. Another prize-winning prof that we had do a 2-minute video at McGill, and for her it was the delivery. So she would have her slides, she would share her slides ahead of time, she would lecture, she would take old-fashioned notes while she lectured, and then she would scan those and put them in the portal as well, right? So yeah, technology, but not incredible technology, old-fashioned technology. She would just realize that because she was taking notes, during a class in a way that was very different from the way she presented the slides, that giving all that to the students just helped learning and made them really, really successful. UDL in action with very little technology there. How do you connect and integrate UDL work in other initiatives? So we've looked at that, and I think, again, it's osmosis. Bring that in. Don't see it as different. See it as in, and then creating a happy place where whatever you're choosing and bringing together, you are focusing on inclusion and accessibility. The usual financial human resourcing, I think we've dealt with that. Tactics to improve culture change in organizations. So again, that openness for opportunities, that almost greed and thirst for any focal form that's given to you. Don't ever say no. Change your message. Use all of the pillars in the needs, right? That enables you to catch. Because if you talk to students, some of these 5 points will be relevant, particularly the last one and social model. If you talk to senior administration, they're going to be receptive to the sustainability and the resource management. If you talk to faculty, they're probably going to be looking at the student voice and social model and a little bit of resource management and a little bit of sustainability. So depending on your stakeholders, if you have all of these arguments systematically, but then you shift the focus depending on who your audience is. Education of academics on UDL. So again, that goes back to using advocates or ambassadors or people showcasing UDL tactics to others. I think that's what you're going to find is the most useful. How to engage in your leadership, we've talked about that too, right? For them, it's probably going to be like the money aspect and the sustainability and the management of resources. Whereabouts in this sort of work sit in universities? Who should be the leaders be approached? So again, that's your ecological mapping. I think we discussed that towards the end of the presentation. So you have all you need there. That's going to depend on your ecological mapping is going to give you the solution. Who should be in the driver's seat? Who should be involved, etc. And that's going to be different from environment to environment. How to ensure the burden of advocating for implementing UDL doesn't solely sit with disabled academics. Well, yeah, and I think that's happening now. So that's a great thing. In North America, although we're not doing that great yet at scaling up, you will see that UDL now is being used more for Indigenous students, the inclusion of Indigenous students by officers supporting international students, second language learners, racialized students. That's happened now. We've shifted out of impairment, and it's really a nice osmosis. And once that osmosis happens, and these people talk to each other and use UDL as a common discourse, that creates momentum. Because again, I will say, if you tally these students on your campuses, it's more than 50% of the campus that actually experiences and encounters the same barriers. I think enabling overworked academics. Yeah, so again here, it's the enabling overworked academics to not see this as a burden. So that's the progressive, slow lens, situate yourself on the spectrum. What is the one thing you will tackle next semester? Reap the success of that and use that as a motivating factor to try the next thing. So what's in it for me culture? Again, I talk in the slides about the social, that, pro-social change, and we know this from, since the Good Samaritan study. It's not about the fact that, oh, we do inclusion because it's great. We do inclusion because quickly our brain makes a balance of the detriments and the benefits. But quickly you're going to be able to see to teachers that if they try out UDL, all of that burden, all of the things that create that tension and that they already find unsustainable. Because again, if you ask any instructor, can they do the job? Can they consider doing the job that they're doing now in 5 years? They're exhausted. They don't want to be doing it anymore because it's really exhausting them. The moment they use UDL, they will report back to you, oh my God, this has made this so much easier. So I have, for example, and people in classics of all things, Miguel, that you would never expect to jump on this, but jumped on board, did a lot of UDL things, came back to us and said, for example, what about those deadlines? We have all this tension with, end of term papers, deadlines. It's not working. People come for exemptions. We have to listen to their story. You have to be intrusive. We have to understand who to give extension to. How can we be UDL about that? And they came up with their own solution. They said, you know what? In our course outlines, we're going to give people a bank of days of grace. So as you begin a 12-week course, everyone has 6 days or 7 days of grace period for assignments. They can not use them. They can use them all. They can use part of them. They can use all of them for one assignment. They can spread around. You maintain the student accountability. You no longer have to be intrusive. You don't have to understand why. You don't have to get people to explain. It's available to all students. All students are automatically accommodated, and it's a universal approach. Well, after that, all of these professors came back from the department saying, you don't understand how much better my job is. The degree of satisfaction that I have in no longer having to have these intrusive conversations, because people now self-manage this universal accommodation that I've put into my course outline, and it works. And it's something that I've bought and I use, and it works very well. How to make complex ideas easily accessible. Well, that's why I think UDL works well, because as I said, it's very hard sometimes to explain to a novice prof that may be a content expert but not a pedagogue what is constructivism, what is social constructivism, what is inclusive pedagogy. But UDL is a very simple, when you look at those 3 principles, because then you approach your barrier and then you choose one of the 3 principles and then you try and apply it till you find a design solution. It's fairly hands-on, it's fairly simple, and that's why I find it really works, because even with the most novice of instructor, when they go through it, it's a very, very simple step-by-step process. And you follow it till you find a solution, and then you integrate a solution, and you wait till you have the result, and then you try tackling another barrier. And I think it has that simplicity that makes it really accessible. It makes it user-friendly for teachers. The scattergun approach of individual department initiative not gaining traction. Well, I think that really you tackle the whole point of the whole presentation, is that if we don't have strategic planning, ecological mapping, strategic planning, very specific intention in the way we organize scaling up and the development of UDL implementation, we get to burnout, and you see lots of sprouting things, but nothing goes anywhere. So that really was the main aim of my talk. So I hope you got a lot from that and answers to that. And then flexible assessment offering choice seems to block the term. Yeah, so flexible assessments, I had some notes at flexible assessment. A lot of people have assumptions. Because because I do flexible assignment, it's gonna be tough, it's gonna be complex for me, it's gonna create problems, it's gonna be unmanageable. I think it's the cliff aspect, right? Try people to try one thing and try one element of flexibility and realize it's not the end of the world. It doesn't create more problems. it allows, it's very manageable, and it creates a lot of satisfaction both for you and for the learner. In graduate courses, I do pre-submissions, for example, which a lot of my colleagues find crazy, and they say, but this is so time consuming. No, because it's pre-submissions. I don't grade them. I read them, and I give full line feedback as to, yes, you've understood the expectations. No, you've not understood expectations. Maybe this section, this is missing. Available to all. Most students take advantage of it. And when the work comes in, it's a lot easier to mark. I spend less time marking because actually the expectations are more generally met and people have understood what the directives were. So instead of having that headache of, oh my God, this is not going the right direction, I wish the students understood, they get that sort of first quick read, enables them to redirect, and I get more students achieving the objectives and having learned competencies through doing that. So the job isn't made more complex. The job is made a lot easier at the end of the day. And there's a lot of UDL strategies where you'll find that, because you're creating flexibility in assignments, it's actually making your job easier. It's not making your job worse. The other thing is, once you create flexibility in assignments, so video podcasts, you will see that students outdo themselves. That's a great thing with options and choice. People get very proud of the fact that they've taken another pathway than just writing, and they will excel. They will produce. You can talk to anyone who does this kind of work with UL. They will produce a final product that will blow your mind away, because they have outworked, gone way over your expectations, and have taken some real pride in producing something really professional. I mean, I do podcasts, for example, and you imagine people will just do a little recording on their video camera. No, I get podcasts that are ready for being sold through iTunes. They are formatted. They have a landing page. There's a background radio sound. These are amazing pieces of professional developments that are produced as podcasts by my students as part of assignments. It will surprise you. So it doesn't make your job harder. It makes your job a lot easier, and you have more satisfaction from it. I think the other thing that I wanted to tackle is, a lot of the times when you do flexibility in assignments, people think, I don't want to do it because I have to be an expert. Like, I don't want to allow a cartoon because I'm not a cartoonist. I don't want to allow a scene played out because I'm not in the performing arts. And there's this almost really mythical thing that because we work as instructors, we have to have full mastery of the competencies for a student to demonstrate that competency in that format. No, you're the content expert. You judge with a rubric the competency being met, but the way it's being met makes no difference to you. I can watch, listen to a 10-minute podcast at professional level. I can watch an interaction between two students that I've seen, students filming like literally a scene that reach and demonstrate the outcomes together in an acted scene. And I'm taking my rubrics and I said, yeah, understood, competence demonstrated, etc., professionalism. All of those things are evident. I don't have to be an expert in performing arts to be able to judge that. But often we double guess ourselves, thinking I can't offer that to a student because I'm not an expert in that. You don't have to be an expert in that format to judge the competencies and the objectives that you're assessing in that format. They are going to become an expert in that format, and that's beautiful. That's the part that's really great and makes your job easier. But they're able to transfer those objectives into that format. You don't have to be an expert at that. They will be the expert at that, but they will demonstrate the objectives the way you want them to be demonstrated. So I hope that this all helped. We've been at it for about an hour. This is another hour on top of the hour that you had for the session. Feel free to contact me at any point. And again, I apologize as I share this on LinkedIn and I share this on Twitter. They will not be captioning, but obviously AdCat will be able to caption this and then share with participants fully captioned. So it's lovely being with you for that session, and lovely being with you with these follow-up questions. And I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to contact me if there's anything at all.